Hello everyone, welcome to the first video in this series of videos about monopolies. These videos pretty much correspond to chapters 9 and 11 in the OpenStax textbook. There will be things covered in these videos that aren't specifically gone over in the textbook very thoroughly, so I would recommend for some of the sections in these videos to really not rely so much on the textbook and rely more on these videos and the lecture notes themselves. So let's go ahead and dive right into this video. And to do that, I want you guys to think back. I think it's about 3 weeks now since we were last in class. So thinking back to when we first started talking about different market structures. And if you recall, when we first introduced this idea of different market structures, I drew what I called the spectrum of competition up on the board. And at one end of the spectrum is perfect competition, where there is the most competition between all of the firms. And at the other end of the spectrum, where there isn't any competition at all, we have monopoly. So this is just to kind of get your head in the right space when thinking about how monopoly relates to everything that we've kind of talked about so far concerning different market structures. And as you can see, perfect competition and monopoly lie on complete opposite ends of this spectrum. So, given that fact, yes, there are, some similarities between these two market structure types, but what we're going to be seeing throughout the course of these videos is that there are quite a few differences between how firms in these different market structures operate, how they choose what quantity to produce, how they choose what price to produce, etc., etc. So we're going to be mainly diving into, a lot of the differences that exist between perfect competition and monopoly. So in addition to kind of exploring these similarities and mainly differences between these two market types, we're going to also explore how the government feels about monopolies and what types of policies the government can enact if they feel they need to control certain types of monopolies. So in addition to talking about, just basic definitions of what a monopoly is, where they come from, how they maximize profit, et cetera, we're also going to look at the public policy side of what the government can or should do when it comes to different monopolies. So now we're going to jump into the specific lecture notes themselves, and I will be right back. Okay, I'm back now. And as you can see, and like I mentioned earlier, these lecture notes are mainly coming from chapters 9 and 11 in the textbook. So kind of a basic outline of the things that we're going to be covering about monopolies. This video is mainly going to be focusing on section 9.1. And this is basically going to define what a monopoly is and why monopolies exist in the first place. In later videos, we'll be talking about how a profit maximizing monopoly chooses what quantity to produce and what price to sell this, quantity at. Also, we'll be talking about this idea of price discrimination and government policies and how these two different things relate to monopolies more specifically. So these ideas of price discrimination and government policies can't, you won't find an exact paragraph in Chapter 9 concerning these two different ideas. So I would mainly rely on the lecture notes and the lecture note videos that are posted here on the YouTube channel for us to get through these different topics together. So, what is a monopoly? Well, a basic definition of a monopoly is just one firm that produces all of the output in a market. Now, as you can tell right away, this is vastly different from how we defined a perfectly competitive market. If you remember, a perfectly competitive market has many buyers and sellers of a specific good. For a monopoly, it's just one business making all of the product and selling it to all of the consumers. Why does this happen? Why does this exist? Well, a simple answer to that would be what is called barriers to entry. Barriers to entry are the legal, technological, or market forces that discourage or prevent potential competitors from entering a market. So again, if you remember back to perfect competition, there was free entry for firms to enter into this market and sell if they want to, and if they aren't making short-run profits, they can shut down or even exit. For a monopoly, there are these barriers to entry that basically have this wall put up, and it prevents other firms from selling the good or the service. It prevents other firms from entering into the market and competing with one another, leaving just that single firm that is able to somehow get past these specific barriers to entry. Now, there are many different types of barriers to entry, which we will go into here in a second, but you can kind of think about defining what a monopoly is based on these barriers to entry. And different types of monopolies can fall into one of two categories. The first category is what is called a natural monopoly. So a natural monopoly is where the specific barriers to entry are something other than legal prohibition. So if there aren't any laws put in place that say only this company can make this good or service, then we call that monopoly a natural monopoly. If there are specific laws that prohibit or severely limit the competition of firms, then we call this a legal monopoly. So if the government has specific laws put in place that says only this firm can make this specific good or service, we call that a legal monopoly. But if it just somehow comes out naturally without laws being put in place, we call it a natural monopoly. So let's dive into a little bit, more of the details surrounding this barriers to entry idea. So one example of a barrier to entry that is actually kind of interesting and rare is what is called monopoly resources. And basically, if one firm owns all of a key resource to make a good or a service, then naturally that firm is going to be a monopoly, right? So I have an example here on the slides. De Beers owns most of the world's diamond mines. So there's this company, it's called De Beers. You can look it up. It's kind of interesting to read about their history and things like that. But De Beers owns pretty much all of the world's diamond mines. So naturally, you would assume that De Beers, the De Beers company, is the only one that's able to produce diamonds in the world. So because De Beers owns all of the diamond mines, they're the only ones that can really produce diamonds in the world. So De Beers has this natural monopoly on producing diamonds because they own a specific key resource in the production process. Another example, it's kind of like an umbrella term for these barriers to entry, would just be government regulation. And to put a definition to that, the government gives a single firm the exclusive right to produce a good. So what are some examples of these different types of laws? Well, they would be like patents or copyright laws and other different types of things like trademarks and things like that. So I have all of these definitions for different types of, government regulations that can be put in place. You don't need to know these definitions specifically. You just need to know that a patent, a copyright, or a trademark, these things fall under the umbrella of government regulations. So for example, if the government gives a specific patent to an inventor or a company for a certain good or a service, then there is a law now that basically says no one else can make this exact same good or service anymore. So, hopefully in a few weeks or months, there is a pharmaceutical company that creates a vaccine for the coronavirus. Most likely, that company will patent their specific formula that they created for the coronavirus vaccine. And once this patent is, approved by the government, that means only that specific pharmaceutical company will be able to produce the coronavirus vaccine. Now, we'll talk more in later videos about whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing, but just know that there are government regulations that can also be a type of barrier to entry. These government regulations prevent other firms from producing the same good or service. And, these things like patents, trademarks, copyrights, they all also kind of fall under this umbrella of intellectual property. So you may have heard this term thrown around in the news and things like that, but just know that intellectual property stems from government regulation. And then a third type of barriers to entry, in addition to the firm just outright owning all of the key resources or the government getting involved, a third thing that could prevent other firms from entering a specific market would be the production process itself. So again, just like owning a key resource, this production process type of barrier to entry would also create a natural monopoly. So if the production process is, let's say, cheaper for one firm to make all of a specific good or a service versus lots of firms trying to make the same good or service, then it would kind of make sense for, just let that one firm produce all of the specific good or service that we're talking about. One example that is, I guess, pretty relevant when we talk about the production process being a barrier to entry would be the electricity market. So in Morgantown, and I think in a lot of the northern part of West Virginia, First Energy Corporation is the business that provides all of the electricity for all of the residents. Now, they are the only company that provides electricity. You can't get electricity from anyone else besides First Energy Corporation. So we would say that First Energy Corporation is a monopoly. How did they form? Well, mainly through this production process barrier to entry. It is cheaper for First Energy Corporation to be the only company that goes through and runs all the wires to all the houses, maintains the electricity plants, versus having several companies trying to run different wires to different houses. It's easier for just one firm to run all of the wires to all of the different houses. So you can also think about this graphically, but it's not entirely important for you to remember this graph. What is important for you to remember is that the production process itself, running the wires to different houses, is actually could be cheaper for one firm to do versus lots of firms trying to all run wires to all of the houses in Morgantown and northern West Virginia. So again, just to kind of summarize how a natural monopoly could form, that first bullet point is just going back over what we talked about in the previous slide. There could be industries such as the electric production industry where, the marginal cost of adding an additional customer is very low. If First Energy Corporation has already run all the wires on a certain street, then it's very easy for them to attach a new wire to a new house if a new house is built on that street. Versus if another company was also trying to provide electricity, and let's say that company had never run a wire on that street at all, they would have to run a wire from the closest street to this new house, and it could be very costly for them to provide electricity to that house versus First Energy Corporation, who was already on that street. So it's really easy for them to just extend the wires. And then the last bullet point is also a key one to remember. Natural monopolies can arise when a company has control of a scarce physical resource. So this goes back to the De Beers example. So the company De Beers owns all the diamond mines. So of course, they're naturally going to have a monopoly on diamond production in the world. So this table on the next slide kind of summarizes everything that we just talked about, talking about all of the different barriers to entry, some things that we may have mentioned, whether or not the government is involved. So with natural monopolies, the government usually is not involved, but with legal monopolies like patents, copyrights, trademarks, the government is involved. And I also have some examples of different companies to kind of wrap your head around these different barriers to entry. One last thing here at the very bottom of the table that the textbook mentions in a couple sentences is this intimidating potential competitors as a barrier to entry. So it's kind of hard to kind of put this in a category of legal or natural, because if a company is just being very aggressive towards other companies, saying, you better not try to compete with me, or else I will undercut you, or whatever. If they're just being really aggressive about letting other companies compete with them, this could be because they actually are the best at making this product, or they could have some government regulations favoring them to be the best producer of this good or service. So you don't have to worry too much about intimidating potential competitors as a barrier to entry. Mainly, I want you to think about barriers to entry falling into two different categories, the natural and the legal. So I think that basically summarizes everything that I want to go over in this video. So stay tuned for the next video where we talk about how a monopoly chooses the profit maximizing quantity and the profit maximizing price. Bye.